and as I say, the shaft was sunk around about 1900. Initially it was just called number 4 bank pit. So there were 2 shafts here, number 3 and number 4 bank pit. Pressure went down number 4 and it was eventually arrived at the surface of number 3. So that was the upcast, this was a downcast. And the name was changed, and that lady was wondering. It was changed to Pretoria pit during the Boer War. So the capital, the Boers' capital was Pretoria. And to celebrate the taking of Pretoria by our forces, they renamed the pit Pretoria pit. So that answers that question. So, sunk in 1900, they didn't have huge coal reserves to go at. Really, this was the last area of unworked coal in the Holton estate. The more ancient workings were more towards where the hall was in the ancient estate itself and north of the A6. So those workings were long worked out that went back centuries. So this was the last effort really by Holton Colliery Company. And you might think Holton Colliery Company would be owned by a lot of local people, but the directors were Liverpool sort of coal merchants. They were the big investors in Holton Colliery Company. The Holtons still took a cut by the coal being extracted beneath their land, so they took a royalty on how many tons of coal were mined underneath their land in the various seams, which is very nice just to sit there and take a nice juicy royalty check. So 1934 the colliery closed. It virtually had exhausted all the coal to go at, so it didn't have a long life really, and everything was sold. All the tubs were brought to the surface like the recreated one, and you'd be amazed how many tubs were in use underground at this colliery. But it said here 1,984 500 weight tubs were brought to the surface and sold. 1,984 of those tubs was in around the workings here. In this engine house, even the clock was sold. It says here, an 8-day clock. So every nut and bolt virtually was sold. You can read a copy of the auction catalogue in Bolton Local Studies Archive or West Orton Local Library in the Pretoria collection upstairs. So for some of those who are interested in the technical side, what sort of steam engine did they have here? Well, it was a horizontal twin-cylinder steam winding engine by Pearson and Knowles Coal and Iron. They were at Warrington. Cylinders 3-foot diameter by 6-foot stroke. A wooden lagged winding drum 18-foot diameter by 8'9" wide. 2 cast iron engine beds that the steam engines were placed on, 38 foot long. Right, and that's the book. That eventually, don't worry, I haven't brought any with me. If you do want to read more in detail, I'm not finished the walk yet. Obvious title, The Pretoria Pit Disaster. My name's Alan Davies. So if you do a search on Google or Amazon or eBay, Alan Davies, comma, coal mining, comma, Pretoria. We'll backtrack, I think. Backtrack and head towards where, that was John entered, yeah. Across here, this path was here when the colliery was going, and there was a line of offices here and a joiner's shop, and they made one of the larger buildings a temporary mortuary, so people could view bodies. The colliery doctor, Holton Colliery Company's doctor, Dr. Hatton, documented everybody that arrived at the surface and the nature of their injuries, and he wrote a piece in the British Medical Journal, or the Lancet, where he went into a lot more detail about the nature of the injuries. It doesn't make very nice reading, I must admit. Apparently, everybody that arrived on surface was also photographed, but I don't know if I need to try and track those down. I can just imagine some avid collector somewhere having those and not letting anyone see them, but I think it's of interest. to me to see them and just log it in my mind, really. But right, so there had to be a big inquiry after the disaster. The first being the big coroner's inquest, 24th of January 1911. That took place in the Carnegie Library at West Orton. You know the library, the red brick library in town centre at West Orton. So it took place there in the big room there. So that's the usual coroner's inquest. Initially the coroner had been involved every time a body had been brought up, or a handful of bodies, and then they realised there were a huge number of bodies arriving at the surface, and they decided they would have a formal single large coroner's inquest after. That was followed by the Home Office inquiry, where you got technical experts, colliery managers, mining engineers, etc., inquiring into the nature of the events that took place here and the causes of the disaster. That took place in the same building, 20th of February, and it lasted till the 9th of March. The colliery manager didn't come out of the inquiry very well. He was actually in charge of 3 different collieries. This colliery, the next one along, number 1 and 2 Bank Pit, and Chequer Bent as well. So the Chief Inspector of Mines recommended that a colliery manager could only be in charge of 1 colliery. Taking on the role of being in charge of 3 wasn't really ideal. And it looks as though the colliery manager here, Alfred Tong, had a detached approach to running this colliery. I think he seems to have relied on his under-managers taking decisions about conditions underground, including the presence of gas. There were a number of reports leading up to the disaster that cited gas being present in different parts of the workings and men being withdrawn, but they don't look as though they took any sort of substantial efforts to really eradicate the gas problem. So he was a bit of a colliery manager that wasn't for getting dirty and being underground regularly. He seems to have been more of an academic sort of colliery manager, writing articles for the Institute of Mining Engineers and that sort of thing. So he came out of it pretty badly. Even so, he was involved in one of the first rescue teams, and when the rescue medals were awarded, only 1 person got the gold Royal Humane Society medal. So you can imagine who that was, colliery manager. So after this disaster, there were changes in mining legislation directly related to this disaster. Every colliery had to have a number of fully trained rescue men available at short notice. Each colliery could have, each mine had to have 1 manager. A colliery manager couldn't be in charge of a number of mines, I mentioned that already. Also stone dust, inert stone dust, such as dolomite or other types of rock, limestone, had to be spread around the workings in the roads where there was lots of dust present to diffuse a potential coal dust explosion. So if the coal dust was whipped up and ignited, also the stone dust would be whipped up as well and fill in the gaps between the coal particles and diffuse the explosion. And that practice was still in use when I was underground at Big Shell Quarry at Lee in the 80s. Over the years I've been asked when were canaries first used after mining disasters in this country, and even when I went to the mining museum I couldn't really find out. Are you alright?
Yeah.
Hi. I couldn't really pin a date down, and then when I was writing the book on Pretoria I saw an article and it said novel use of canaries after mining disaster, and the article as good as said this was the first time that canaries were taken underground after a mining disaster or an explosion. So that's the first of a sort, isn't it? So straight away money started to flow into the colliery offices at Chequer Bent, people giving donations, and the Hulton Colliery Disaster Relief Fund was set up. Eventually it was administered at Bolton Town Hall. And the colliery manager was involved in the committee that oversaw the distribution of the money that was being donated. but he didn't stay around very long. I think he must have felt a bit uneasy about his part in the disaster or his lack of diligence. And we find in June 1912 him and his family embarking for Nova Scotia. And he went there to manage a large coal mine, one of the largest coal mines in Nova Scotia. And guess what happened in July 1917 under his control? There was a big explosion in the workings and 62 men and boys died. So whether he took his rather lax approach to coal management with him, I don't know. I did a guided walk a few years ago and I mentioned this, and a man came up to me and said, actually I'm distantly related to Alfred Thomas, and not to be guilty. He said, but I have read the report and it is true what he says. I got out of that. Right, so if a widow had lost her husband and boys in the disaster, she could draw on the Hulton Colliery Disaster Relief Fund, the Workmen's Compensation Act, which covered all sorts of industries. If she'd paid her subs to the Lancashire Cheshire Miners Permanent Relief Society based at Wigan, she had money coming in from there. And I saw an article in the Daily Sketch just after the disaster, and the journalist, typical journalist, nothing changes, said actually some of the widows are financially better off than they were before the disaster. I thought, wow, you know, nothing changes in the world of journalism, does it?
Round here all my life. I went to St Andrews at Four Lane Ends and then to Lee Grammar School. The Pretoria mining disaster was never mentioned once when I was at school. Never mentioned. I knew a lot about Henry VIII, Napoleonic Wars, but nothing about this. And now with the work that Alan's doing, with what we're doing, school children are being brought round in parties. It's being made a topic of study in our local schools. That's why this is so important.